going back, obviously you and I had the same teachers. Our father Jack and our grandfather Duncan, gave us all a basic horsemanship, and then you worked for me for a while, and then you worked for Glenn Garnsey for a period, and Glenn at that time had one of the top Grand Circuit stables. Just talk about what you learned from where we came from on the farm in Elsie Craig through up going to Windsor, Meadowlands, and then working for Glenn, and how much impact that has on the decisions you make today.
Well, when I was younger, don't take offense to this, John, but I liked working with Dad much better than I liked working for you and Grandpa. You two were too tough. But working for Dad, as you well know, he was the greatest teacher any of us could have, because he had the theory that the only way you were going to learn is to do it. And I remember one day, I made a mistake doing something, I forget what it was, and Dad said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "That's how you learn." He said, "If you keep making it 2 or 3 times, then you're going to have to worry about it." But Dad was a good horseman, as you well know, and he like you said, he was the greatest teacher, because he wanted you to get out there and do it, and if you made a mistake, he'd point it out to you. And I just I had a lot of great memories working with Dad. And I remember Dad and I were in Mohawk, and he said, "I think you should go down to the Meadowlands, go work for John." He said, "I think you'll have a better opportunity there." The first thing that flashed through my mind was me being 10 and you 17, and I didn't think you were real easy to work for back when I was 10. And I'm like, "You think so, Dad?" And he goes, "No." He said, "If you don't like it, you can always come back." So then when I went to work for you, it was just like working for Dad. You were the same way. You would explain things to me, and you taught me so much over the years. But I think the most important thing that you taught me was how to try to rig good horses for big races. And you were the best at that. And that's what if somebody asked me, "What's one thing your brother taught you the most?" and that would be how to rig a good horse for big races.
And then moving on to Glenn Garnsey, that would have to be just more of a continuing education for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, working for Glenn gave me a different look of the Grand Circuit. What all went into, because Glenn had all basically 2 and 3-year-olds, and that was kind of, we had a few trotters when I worked for you, but Glenn had a lot of trotters, and Glenn was very, very good horseman, and he was good to point out different things for you. But it really gave me a good experience, being around a big stable and how it runs, and working with the young horses and everything like that. And it was an experience that I'm sure glad I took, because I really enjoyed the 2 years I was with Glenn.
So going back to that period of time, I think we both agreed that horses have changed so dramatically, and I'm sure you learned different things from Glenn and training techniques. And so the horses have changed dramatically since that time. Training techniques have changed dramatically since that time. Just kind of take us through that progression. And this is your second Hambletonian win, Tagliabue in '95. Just the changes from changing, or how you trained Tagliabue, to how you prepped Fashion Schooner and Cool Papa Bell in 2022.
Well, I think one of the biggest changes, that was 27 years ago with Tagliabue. I think back then, we were, or at least I was always under the assumption that they needed a race 7 days before a big race, or if the big race was the eliminations, they needed to race before then, and would probably train 2 trips or a double header in between those races. And then fast forward it to today, I love to race a horse with 2 or 3 week layoff in between races, because they're just so much more athletic, and they don't need the extra trips. My training is mile and a halves, and depending on how many weeks they've had off, depends on how fast we go. But the whole idea is just to get their heart rates up. These horses today, they're just they're so athletic and a lot easier to keep in shape. And I think just as long as you keep them on a regular routine and get their heart rates up at least once a week, if they're going 2 or 3 weeks in between, they'll be just as good for the race as if they'd raced the week before. One of the biggest things that I've noticed, it used to be years ago, it was hard to train a trotter in with a pacer, because when you'd go to step them along that last quarter, the trotters couldn't stick with the pacers. Where now, I don't have many pacers anymore, but the last couple of years when I did have some, the trotters would outstep the pacers.
That's amazing when you think back of, the weight they used to have on them, and it took them forever to get going, and the fact that they could step by pacers, you would have never dreamt of that 30 years ago, that's for sure.
No, or not even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I can remember getting mad at one of my assistants. He had a pacer and I had a trotter, and it was probably 20 years ago, and he stepped them up a little too much, and I couldn't keep up, and the trotter made a break, and I'm telling him, you can't step a pacer along that the trotters can't keep up.
It's a little hypocritical, criticizing how I was to work for, and here you are yelling at your help.
I learned that from you, John.
So, yearlings. When you're looking at yearlings today, obviously a totally different horse to look at. Is there things that you overlook today that you wouldn't overlook years ago, or vice versa, stuff that you overlooked then that you just can't overlook now in yearlings?
I think what's changed, I think if you look hard enough on a high percentage of them, they're going to be offsetting their knees a little bit, or they might stand a little toed out. Speaking strictly with the trotters, that's where I do like watching the videos of them. I know some of them can be doctored up a little bit, but I just mostly like the front view and the hind view. The side view means nothing to me. They look like they're going 55 shot when you watch them from the side. But I still like to see how they walk, just how they put their feet down. I try to stay away from anything that I think has, contracted heels, or, their feet are chopped right off. A lot of times they're trying to hide a horse that has a club foot. And mostly you want to look for an athletic looking horse, because big and good looking sometimes doesn't get it like it used to.
You did drive a certain amount when you started out, and I think you have an appreciation for how horses change. You've got a story there about qualifying horses one day that I was supposed to make it to Garden State, and something happened, I didn't get there, and you went with the horses and came off the track shaking your head after almost every one. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I still, Timmy and I, we talk a lot of different things, and I've told him that story several times. They were green 3-year-olds that we were getting ready for the Meadowlands meet, and they were in to qualify at Garden State, and you couldn't make it down, so you just said, just go with them yourself. And we had 6 of them that were in to go. And I remember when I got done, I called you up and I said, boy, am I ever glad you didn't come down. You said, why? I said, well, the ones that I thought would run in were running out, and the ones that I thought would run out were running in. I said, you would have thought that I didn't have a clue how to rig a horse. And that did teach me a lot. And that's like when you were driving and you'd get off the bike and say, this horse is doing that. And I realized back then that they go a lot different when they're going racing speed. They feel things differently as opposed to when they're just training. And if you really think about it, if they're out there going a training mile, they maybe only step along like a good eighth or a good quarter, but they're not going a quarter in 26 or 27 seconds. And the difference that they feel going that high speed and have to go 4 quarters at high speed makes a big difference into them. And that's why I've through dealing this, especially with you when you were driving a lot of my horses when I was getting started, I always wanted good feedback from the driver. And in today's world, I think Timmy gives me good feedback, and we have a good relationship because he knows that I'm looking for feedback, and he gives me good feedback like you did back when you were driving.
And training colts down. You've got a 2-year-old training down. You have to think is good, and many times you'll be fooled, and many times you've been fooled, or not many times. It doesn't happen near as often as you would like that the ones that just train okay turn out better, but many times those colts that train down so good just don't turn out the way they feel a mile and 2.5 versus a mile and 1:55. Tell us about the No Nukes colt that you owned yourself that you baby raced at Gateway a couple times and then brought him to the Meadowlands and got a dose of reality.
Well, he was an expensive yearling that I ended up taking a piece of him, and he was one of those horses that he did train down good, and I did baby race him twice at Gateway, and he won both his baby races. And so I took him to the Meadowlands, and you were driving him, and I knew I was in trouble at the 3/4 pole because you had him out in the second tier and he wasn't advancing, and he just went out there and just kind of hung, probably finished like 5th or 6th, and you got off him, and I said, must be something wrong with him, and you said, yeah, I don't think he's any good. I said, no, that can't be. And you go, well, you can go check him out, but I don't think he's any good. And as it turned out, you were right. He had speed, but he only wanted to use it when it was convenient for him, and that's the problem with some horses that aren't good horses. They'll train down, like when it's their idea to go fast, they feel good, but then when it comes time for racing and you want them to go faster and they don't feel like going, then they won't go. But I got another quick story to tell you too, that it was the first crop of Die Laughing, and I had one that I thought was the top colt. So we're walking out of the paddock, and I hand you the lines, and I said, this is my best colt. A couple minutes later, you're handing me the lines back, and you said, if this is your best colt, you're in trouble. And he turned out he just had cheap speed.
Yeah, it's an inexact science figuring those colts out until they get tired. There's no question about that.
But on a different note, you went out and qualified. You qualified one that you had actually trained for me before the March payments, a trotting colt, and you liked him when you trained him, and he was training down. He was kind of under the radar. Like in our barn, we had more flashier horses, and when you baby raced this 2-year-old for the first time, you got off the bike and you said, this is a good horse. This is a top horse right here, and that was Broadway Hall.
Yeah, he showed me stuff right. He just came as a professional. I really liked him right from the start. It was a shame that what happened to him. He didn't make it back at 3, but he had a tremendous attitude, that horse, and you could tell there was quite a bit of power there right from the start. It's really difficult to tell them until they get into competition and they get stressed.
Yes.
What you're going to have, but